The Isanza River, not wide but treacherous, with its steep banks and swift current, became the last line of German defense in the spring of 1945. Winding through the hilly plains of Eastern Europe, this waterway transformed into a natural shield for the retreating Wehrmacht troops. The German command, realizing the strategic value of this position, turned the coastal zone into an impregnable fortress, the last significant defensive line before the final Allied advance. Soviet and Polish units, inspired by the proximity of victory, sought to force the river to hasten the end of the war. For the Poles, it was a chance to avenge years of occupation. For Soviet soldiers, an opportunity to finish off the enemy in his lair. On the eve of the battle, both sides understood. The battle for Isanza would be one of the last major clashes of this war. The Germans had concentrated elite units here, equipping the banks with pillboxes and minefields. The air was permeated with a premonition of impending tragedy. The river would soon be stained with the blood of thousands of soldiers from both sides. By the spring of 1945, the strategic situation on the Eastern Front was unequivocally not in favor of the Third Reich. Soviet troops, having covered thousands of kilometers from Stalingrad and Kursk, reached the approaches to Berlin. Polish units, fighting shoulder to shoulder with the Red Army, were eager to finally liberate their homeland. However, the German command, understanding the inevitability of defeat, decided to prolong the agony of the war by creating a powerful defensive line on the Isanza River. Hitler personally ordered the Isanza line to be held to the last soldier. Field Marshal Model, dubbed the Führer's fireman for his ability to stabilize the most hopeless sectors of the front, sent the remnants of SS Panzer divisions and elite infantry units to this area. The Germans hoped that holding this line would buy time to evacuate military specialists and valuable equipment to the Alpine regions, where an Alpine fortress was planned to be created to continue resistance. The Soviet command, led by Marshal Zhukov, developed a plan for a swift breakthrough of the German defenses. It was envisioned that a massive artillery barrage would suppress enemy firing positions, after which the river would be forced simultaneously in several sectors, creating bridgeheads for a further offensive. A special role was assigned to the Polish units under the command of General Zwierczewski, who were to deliver the main blow in the center of the German defensive line. However, intelligence failed to fully assess the scale of the fortifications created by the Germans. Using the natural landscape, Wehrmacht engineering units turned the western bank of the Isanza into a real labyrinth of pillboxes, bunkers, and multi-tiered firing positions. The depth of the defense reached 15 kilometers in some places. The Germans skillfully camouflaged artillery batteries, created false positions to disorient Soviet aerial reconnaissance, and mined all approaches to the river. A distinctive feature of the German defense was the system of wandering machine guns, mobile firing points that could quickly move along pre-prepared trenches, creating the impression of a numerous garrison. Tanks were partially dug into the ground, turning into stationary firing points with excellent armor protection. The Polish and Soviet command, despite the lack of information, decided to launch the offensive in mid-April. Inspired by previous successes, they did not suspect what price they would have to pay for crossing this inconspicuous river. The Germans, understanding the hopelessness of their situation on a global scale, were ready to fight with the desperation of the doomed, turning the banks of the Isanza into the last significant line of resistance on the Eastern Front, the Isanetz Line. This is what German engineers dubbed their latest defensive marvel. The western bank of the river was transformed into a true masterpiece of fortification art, where every meter of land worked against the advancing enemy. German engineering units, utilizing 4 years of war experience, created a 3-tiered defense system here, organically integrated into the natural landscape. The first line of fortifications was located directly along the water's edge. Machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire were equipped here, completely controlling the water surface. A unique feature of these fortifications were special concrete hoods with narrow embrasures, making them virtually invulnerable to artillery fire. Each such pillbox was connected by underground passages to command posts in the rear. The second line, located 100 to 200 meters from the bank, consisted of a system of bunkers dug into the hilly terrain. The Germans skillfully used the relief, placing firing points on elevated positions, which provided excellent visibility and the ability to conduct aimed fire at advancing units. These fortifications often had false entrances and exits, confusing the enemy and complicating their capture. The third line represented artillery positions, located 2 to 3 kilometers from the bank. Heavy guns and mortar batteries were placed here, capable of covering any point of the river with fire. To protect against air raids, artillery positions were skillfully disguised as rural buildings or natural objects. A special engineering solution was the use of a controlled flooding system. The Germans built several small dams upstream, which could be blown up at the right moment, causing a sharp rise in water level and disrupting crossings. The entire coastal zone was covered with minefields, with mines laid in several layers with different types of fuses. Wehrmacht engineers employed an innovative system of "1" light armored shelters that could be quickly moved to pre-prepared positions. This created the illusion of a much larger garrison for the attackers and made it difficult to suppress firing points. Anti-tank defenses were organized using natural ravines and artificial ditches filled with water. On tank-dangerous directions, reinforced concrete pyramids, "2", were installed, as well as anti-tank hedgehogs made from railway rails. All these engineering solutions, multiplied by the fanatical resistance of German soldiers, turned the forcing of the Isanets into a real nightmare for Soviet Polish troops. Even massive artillery shelling could not completely suppress this deeply echeloned defense. Every meter had to be literally wrested from the enemy's hands, paying for advancement with the blood of soldiers. Behind every great battle stand people whose decisions determine the destinies of thousands of soldiers. The Battle of Isanza was no exception. Here, not only armies clashed, but also military geniuses, each with their own vision of tactics and strategy. On the German side, the defense was led by Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici, a recognized master of defensive operations. He was called the unsurpassed specialist in retreats, not because he fled the battlefield, but because he knew how to organize a systematic withdrawal of troops with minimal losses. Heinrici was the complete opposite of a typical Nazi general. Reserved, methodical, he preferred to save the lives of his soldiers rather than throw them into senseless attacks. By the spring of 1945, he had colossal experience of battles on the Eastern Front. He thoroughly studied the tactics of the Soviet troops and was able to anticipate their actions. It was Heinrici who insisted on creating a deeply echeloned defense on the Isanza, contrary to Berlin's initial plans. On the Soviet side, the offensive was led by Army General Vasily Chuikov, the legendary defender of Stalingrad who turned urban warfare into an art. His signature style was the tactic of fighting in an embrace with the enemy, maximum rapprochement with German positions, which made it difficult for the enemy to use artillery and aviation. Chuikov was a tough commander, demanding of himself and his subordinates. Soldiers respected and feared him at the same time. The Polish units were commanded by General Karol Świerczewski, a charismatic leader who had fought in the Spanish Civil War. He was distinguished by personal bravery and a willingness to share all the hardships of frontline life with his soldiers. However, military historians note that Świerczewski was sometimes overly impulsive in making decisions, which led to unjustifiably high losses during the first attempts to cross the river. A special role in the battle was played by German Colonel Otto Skorzeny, who led special sabotage groups. This man, who organized the liberation of Mussolini and Operation Griffin in the Ardennes, created a network of false positions and radio transmitters on the Isanza, disorienting Soviet intelligence. His saboteurs, disguised in Soviet uniforms, sowed panic in the rear of the advancing troops. Interestingly, among the middle-ranking commanders on both sides, there were many who had fought on the Isanza back in the First World War. Their experience and knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable in planning operations. Personal animosity between some commanders also influenced the course of the battle. For example, German General Walter Wenck and Soviet General Chuikov had been long-standing adversaries since the Battle of Stalingrad, and each sought to outwit the other in military cunning. The dawn of April 16, 1945, was met with the deafening roar of Soviet artillery. 5,000 guns and mortars unleashed their might on the western bank of the Isanets, where German units lay in wait. The earth trembled, the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and burnt fumes. It seemed nothing could survive this steel hurricane. Soviet and Polish soldiers, pressed against the river's eastern bank, watched with hope as shells plowed through enemy positions. At 6:30, the long-awaited signal to attack sounded. The assault groups of the Polish Kościuszko Infantry Division were the first to rush to the river. On inflatable boats and makeshift rafts, they began to force the narrow but swift Isanets. Suddenly, the German fortifications, which seemed to have been destroyed by the artillery preparation, sprang to life. Dozens of machine guns opened crossfire on the crossing units. German General Heinrici had anticipated the massive artillery preparation and ordered his troops to withdraw from the first line of defense into deep concrete shelters. As soon as Soviet artillery shifted its fire deeper into the defense, German machine gunners returned to their positions and met the attackers with a hail of fire. The first wave of Polish assault groups was almost completely annihilated. Boats, riddled with machine gun bursts, capsized. Soldiers attempting to swim to shore drowned under the weight of their equipment or became easy targets. The waters of the Isanets turned red. The Soviet command, realizing the failure of the first attempt, quickly regrouped its forces. Smoke screens were deployed, intended to conceal the crossing from enemy-aimed fire. Under their cover, the second wave of attackers, now reinforced by Soviet assault engineer sapper battalions, rushed to the river. This time, several groups managed to gain a foothold on the western bank. Fierce, hand-to-hand combat ensued for every meter of the coastal strip. Polish and Soviet soldiers displayed miracles of heroism, trying to expand the tiny bridgeheads. It was at this moment that the Germans launched an unexpected counterattack. Camouflaged tank groups, whose existence Allied intelligence was unaware of, attacked the flanks of the established bridgeheads. Simultaneously, German artillery unleashed a barrage of fire on the eastern bank, where the main forces were preparing to cross. The Germans' use of rocket mortars, dubbed Vanyushas by Soviet soldiers, as opposed to their Katyushas, proved particularly effective. Volleys from these weapons literally swept away entire units preparing to cross the river. By midday, it became clear that the initial breakthrough plan had failed. The small bridgeheads on the western bank held on with their last strength, and reinforcements could not overcome the water barrier under hurricane enemy fire. The front commander was forced to halt the offensive and begin regrouping forces. The German command on the Isanets demonstrated the highest mastery of military cunning, transforming tactical deceptions into a true art form. The chief architect of these disinformation operations was Colonel Werner Hasse, a former theater director who applied his knowledge of scenography to the battlefield. Under his leadership, entire ghost battalions were created, systems of false targets simulating the movement of large military formations. Inflatable mock-ups of tanks and artillery pieces were mounted on special platforms that moved along pre-laid hidden routes. At night, sound effects were used, recordings of vehicle movements and commands broadcast through loudspeakers. Soviet aerial reconnaissance repeatedly recorded the movements of large tank columns, which would disappear the next day as if dissolving into thin air. An especially effective tactic was the simulation of retreat. The Germans deliberately weakened their defenses in certain sectors, creating the appearance of panic and disorderly flight. When Soviet and Polish units rushed into these breaches, they were met with a torrent of fire from pre-prepared ambushes. This occurred in the northern sector of the Isanets, where an entire Polish battalion was almost completely annihilated after falling into such a trap. The Germans also masterfully used radio deception. Special groups of radio operators conducted false negotiations, deliberately revealing plans for the redeployment of reserves or the evacuation of headquarters. Soviet radio intelligence intercepted these messages, and the command adjusted their offensive plans, directing their main forces to empty positions, while real fortifications remained untouched. One of the most dramatic moments was Operation Phantom, a large-scale staging of a breakthrough by Soviet tanks to the western bank of the Isanets. German saboteurs in Soviet uniforms and on captured tanks with red stars simulated a successful river crossing. According to a prearranged plan, German units began a panic-stricken retreat. Observers from the eastern bank reported a successful breakthrough, and the main forces received orders to immediately cross the river to exploit the success. When hundreds of boats with infantry found themselves in the middle of the Isanets, the retreating German units suddenly turned around and opened hurricane fire on the crossing. Simultaneously, disguised artillery struck the initial positions on the eastern bank. The result was catastrophic losses among the attackers. The dawn of the third day of the Battle of Isanza illuminated a scene of unparalleled courage from Polish soldiers. The First Polish Army, under General Zwierczewski, received orders to break through German defenses in the central sector, where the enemy had established particularly strong fortifications. Commanders understood that this would cost many lives, but there was no other way. The first to engage in battle were the assault groups of the 4th Infantry Division, named after Jan Kalinski. Captain Tadeusz Nowak, a veteran of the battles for Warsaw, led his company through the icy waters of the Isanza under heavy fire. "For Poland! For our mothers and sisters!" he shouted, rallying his men to attack. Of his company's 48 men, only 17 reached the western bank. The captain himself was wounded 3 times, but continued to command until a German bullet ended his life at the very edge of the enemy trenches. The 1st Tank Corps of the Polish Army distinguished itself particularly. Colonel Józef Kimbar, commander of the Armored Brigade, personally led the breakthrough. His tank crews, realizing that a conventional crossing was impossible, resorted to a desperate measure, forcing the river along its bottom. The crews sealed their vehicles using improvised materials and special kits for underwater driving. 5 T-34 tanks plunged into the murky waters of the Isanza. 3 of them got stuck at the bottom, becoming a mass grave for their crews. 2 broke through to the western bank, unexpectedly appearing behind German fortifications and sowing panic among the defenders. Major Stanislaw Grabski's battalion, consisting predominantly of natives from occupied Silesia, attacked the German positions with particular ferocity. These men fought for their homes, for their families. When ammunition ran out, they charged with bayonets. German prisoners later recounted the horror they experienced seeing Poles with fixed bayonets running directly into machine guns. Polish sappers wrote a special page in the history of the battle. A group of 8 men under the command of Lieutenant Kazimierz Olszewski volunteered to destroy a key German pillbox that controlled the entire central section of the crossing. Under the cover of night, the sappers swam across the river, pulling explosive charges behind them. Everyone understood that this was a one-way trip. The Germans discovered the group when it had already reached the concrete fortifications. An unequal battle ensued. The last surviving sapper, mortally wounded, managed to detonate the charge, destroying the pillbox along with himself and 20 German soldiers. Polish nurses displayed no less bravery than the combatants. Helena Kowalczyk, a 20-year-old girl from Krakow, swam across the Isanza 5 times under incessant fire, pulling wounded soldiers from the western bank. On the 6th time, a machine gun burst ended her life. By the end of the 3rd day of fighting, Polish units, at the cost of enormous losses, managed to secure a small bridgehead. Of the 3,000 soldiers who began the attack, fewer than 800 remained in formation. But they did not retreat an inch, holding the blood-bought land. Their sacrifice was not in vain. By tying down significant enemy forces, they allowed Soviet units to achieve a successful breakthrough in the northern sector of the Isanza. The Soviet command, facing the powerful German defense on the Isanets, decided to change tactics. Instead of frontal infantry assaults, a plan for a combined attack was developed, utilizing specialized assault groups and armored vehicles. Each such group represented a well-balanced combat organism, including sappers, flamethrower operators, machine gunners, and soldiers with anti-tank weapons. They were supported by Su-122 and Su-100 self-propelled artillery units, capable of direct fire against German bunkers and pillboxes. T-34 tanks equipped with mine trawls played a special role. They cleared paths through minefields, providing corridors for infantry advancement. Engineer units prepared special assault bridges and rafts capable of supporting the weight of light armored vehicles. To overcome the steep banks of the Isanets, Soviet engineers created unique folding structures, metal ladders with hooks that could be quickly installed on precipitous sections. Tank crews trained in the art of overcoming water obstacles by crossing the riverbed using special OPVT sealing kits. This allowed tanks to unexpectedly appear in the rear of German fortifications, sowing panic among the defenders. Aviation was tasked not only with bombing German positions, but also with creating smoke screens to cover the crossing. Il-2 attack aircraft, dubbed Black Death by the Germans, carried out pinpoint strikes on identified enemy firing positions. Night attacks proved particularly effective when Soviet armored boats with landing troops on board slipped to the western bank under the cover of darkness. The landed groups seized bridgeheads, which were then expanded with the arrival of main forces. The Germans countered this tactic with a deeply echeloned anti-tank defense. In addition to traditional anti-tank ditches and minefields, they widely used disguised artillery ambushes. Heavy 88mm PaK-44 anti-tank guns were capable of hitting Soviet tanks at a range of up to 2 kilometers. To combat self-propelled units, the Germans used mobile groups with Faustpatron anti-tank weapons, which attacked armored vehicles from the flanks and rear. Fierce battles unfolded for every meter of the western bank. Soviet assault groups, having secured a bridgehead, immediately dug in and organized an all-around defense. Sappers, under enemy fire, built crossings for the approach of reinforcements. The struggle for the commanding heights, controlling the approaches to the river, proved particularly difficult. The Germans turned every hill into a miniature fortress with a developed system of trenches and firing positions. Soviet assault groups literally had to gnaw through the enemy's defenses, destroying one stronghold after another. April 25, 1945, went down in the history of the Battle of Isanza as the day of maximum losses for both warring sides. With the first rays of dawn, the Soviet command launched Operation Thunderstorm, a massive offensive along the entire front line. Artillery preparation lasted 2 hours. More than 7,000 guns unleashed a barrage of unprecedented power on German positions. The earth trembled, the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and burning. It seemed that nothing living could survive this steel hurricane. However, the German command, anticipating such a development, had previously withdrawn most of its troops to the second and third lines of defense, leaving only observers in the forward trenches. As soon as the artillery preparation ended and the first assault groups began to cross the river, the Germans returned to their positions. A real massacre began. The first wave of attackers was almost completely destroyed. Pontoons and boats, riddled with machine gun fire, overturned. Soldiers drowned under the weight of their equipment. The second and third waves of attackers also met fierce resistance. The 4th Polish Infantry Division suffered particularly heavy losses. Of the 3,000 soldiers who began the crossing, only 700 reached the western bank. The rest perished in the icy waters of the Isanza, or were mowed down by German machine guns. A critical moment was the attack of the Soviet 115th Tank Brigade. 26 vehicles tried to cross the pontoon bridge built by sappers. German artillery concentrated fire on the crossing. The lead tank was destroyed by a direct hit, blocking the movement of the others. A traffic jam of armored vehicles formed, an ideal target for German artillerymen and aviation. In a matter of minutes, 17 tanks were destroyed along with their crews. The situation was aggravated by the fact that the German command chose this very moment for a counterattack. A masked group of 15 Tigers and Panthers attacked the flank of the Soviet troops, creating a threat of encirclement. Only by the heroic efforts of the anti-tank regiment's artillerymen were the German tanks stopped. By noon, on several sectors, Soviet and Polish troops managed to gain a foothold on the western bank, creating small bridgeheads. However, the Germans immediately pulled reserves to these points and began methodically squeezing the enemy back to the river. Particularly fierce battles unfolded for height 123, dominating the area. This small elevation changed hands 7 times during the day. By evening, its slopes were literally strewn with the bodies of the dead from both sides. By the end of the day, it became obvious that the breakthrough had failed. The Soviet command was forced to order a retreat to the initial positions. The evacuation of the wounded from the western bank turned into a separate tragedy. Many died trying to cross back across the river under continuous enemy fire. This day became a turning point in the Battle of Isanza. Both sides suffered colossal losses, but neither achieved strategic success. The German command used up its last reserves to repel the attack, while Soviet and Polish troops lost their best assault units. The subsequent days of the battle were no longer as intense. Both armies were bled dry. The deeply echeloned defense implemented by the German command at the Isanza became a true masterpiece of military engineering thought. In contrast to earlier periods of the war, when the Germans relied on powerful but linear fortifications, a fundamentally different concept was applied here. The defense was built not as a continuous line, but as a system of interconnected strongholds, arranged in a checkerboard pattern to a depth of up to 15 kilometers. Each such stronghold was a miniature fortress, capable of conducting an all-round defense even if surrounded. A key principle was the multi-layered echeloning of firepower. The forward line consisted mainly of light machine guns and rifle positions camouflaged in the coastal thickets. Their task was not so much to stop the enemy as to slow his advance and force him to deploy into battle formations. The second line, located 300 to 500 meters from the shore, included heavy machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank guns. These firing points were placed on elevations, which provided excellent visibility and overlapping fields of fire. A distinctive feature was the system of underground communications. Concrete passages allowed for fast and safe transfer of reinforcements to threatened sectors. The third line consisted of artillery positions located 3 to 5 kilometers from the shore. Here, heavy guns were concentrated, capable of covering any point of the river and coastal strip with fire. Artillery positions were carefully camouflaged and equipped with false targets to distract enemy aircraft. German engineers masterfully utilized the terrain. All natural obstacles, ravines, hills, forested areas were integrated into the defense system. Anti-tank ditches were laid out considering probable directions of armored attack. Minefields were not laid in a continuous line, but in the form of mine clusters, covering the most convenient areas for advance. Special attention was paid to mobile reserves. In the rear of the defense, tank and motorized groups were constantly present, ready to counterattack a breakthrough enemy. These reserves were located in pre-prepared shelters, protected from air raids and artillery fire. The defense control system was built on the principle of decentralization. Commanders of individual strongholds had significant freedom of action, which allowed for flexible response to changes in the combat situation. At the same time, all links of the defense were connected by reliable wired communication, duplicated by radio networks. The most vulnerable areas were covered by a system of controlled inundations. Small dams on the tributaries of the Isanza could be blown up on command, turning lowlands into impassable marshes for vehicles. Such a multi-layered defense system allowed German troops, inferior to the enemy in numbers and equipment, to successfully repel massive attacks by Soviet Polish forces. Even with a breakthrough of the first or second line, the attackers inevitably came under flanking fire from neighboring strongholds and strikes from mobile reserves. This led to enormous losses among the attackers and ultimately to the disruption of the operation to force the Isanza. The sky over Isanza became an arena for battles no less fierce than the ground beneath it. The air war here acquired a special character, largely determining the outcome of the entire battle. Soviet aviation, represented by fighter and ground attack regiments, sought to provide cover for advancing troops and suppress German defensive positions. The legendary Il-2 ground attack aircraft, dubbed Black Death by the Germans, delivered pinpoint strikes against identified firing points, bunkers, and enemy artillery positions. Group attacks by ILs proved particularly effective when 8 to 10 aircraft sequentially processed one defense sector, leaving no chance of survival for the defenders. Yak-3 and La-7 fighters provided cover for ground attack aircraft and bombers, engaging in fierce dogfights with German Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts. Air duels over Isanza were distinguished by particular ferocity. Both sides understood the critical importance of air superiority for the outcome of the ground operation. The German command, despite the general shortage of aircraft on the Eastern Front, managed to concentrate significant air forces in the Isanza area. The Luftwaffe relied on the qualitative superiority of its aircraft and the experience of its pilots. The Me-262 jet fighters appearing over the battlefield caused a real shock among Soviet pilots. These machines, capable of speeds up to 800 kilometers per hour, were practically invulnerable to piston-engine fighters. However, their numbers were limited, and their short range and unreliable engines reduced their effectiveness. A feature of the air war over Isanza was the widespread use of anti-aircraft artillery by the Germans. The density of anti-aircraft fire was such that Soviet pilots called the sky over the river "steel rain." German anti-aircraft batteries were arranged in a circular order, creating a multi-layered air defense system. The rapid-firing Oerlikon and Flak 38 anti-aircraft guns proved particularly effective, literally saturating the air with deadly metal. The Soviet command developed special tactics to overcome this defense. Ground attack aircraft approached targets at extremely low altitudes, using terrain folds for camouflage. Bombers, on the other hand, attacked from high altitudes, staying out of range of light anti-aircraft weapons. Specialized groups of ground attack aircraft, armed with anti-tank guns and rockets, were used to suppress anti-aircraft batteries. The Soviet ace, Ivan Kozhedub, became a true hero of the air battles over Isanza, shooting down 7 German aircraft in 3 days of fighting. In a memorable air battle on April 26th, he, in his La-7, managed to achieve victory over a jet Me-262 using the superior maneuverability of his machine. This incident became legendary in the history of Soviet aviation. The German side countered Soviet aces with its experienced pilots. Erich Hartmann, with over 300 victories to his credit, personally led the actions of fighter group JG-52. His hit-and-run tactics allowed him to maximize the advantages of German aircraft and minimize losses. Bomber aviation was crucial to the outcome of the battle. Soviet PE-2s and American A-20s, supplied under Lend-Lease, delivered massive strikes against German communications, ammunition depots, and reserves. Night raids proved particularly effective when bombers, invisible to enemy fighters, systematically destroyed the rear infrastructure of the German defense. Behind the front lines, the Battle of Isanza had its own special human dimension. While armies fought for every meter of land, thousands of wounded, civilians, and prisoners of war found themselves at the epicenter of a humanitarian catastrophe. Field hospitals on both sides operated at their limits. Soviet Field Hospital No. 126, deployed 3 kilometers from the river's eastern bank, admitted up to 500 wounded daily. Surgeons operated for 18 to 20 hours non-stop, falling asleep for a few minutes between operations. Nurse Anna Kovaleva recalled, "Polish medical services had an especially difficult time. Lacking sufficient medicines and equipment, Polish doctors performed miracles of ingenuity. Wine bottles, sterilized in boiling water, were used for blood transfusions. Splints for broken limbs were made from branches and broken crates. German medics, despite the overall scarcity of resources, were better equipped. Their field hospitals had mobile X-ray units and even anesthesia machines. However, they faced another problem: constant bombardments by Soviet aviation. Despite the Red Crosses on hospital roofs, they became targets for attack aircraft. The civilian population found itself between a hammer and an anvil. over 10,000 people were forced to leave their homes in the combat zone. Most of them, women, children, and the elderly, moved eastward towards Soviet troops. Columns of refugees stretched for many kilometers along the roads. People carried only the bare necessities. Many pushed carts with their household belongings. The Soviet command, not expecting such a flow of civilians, was unprepared to receive them. There was a shortage of food, medicine, and temporary housing. Refugees were housed in hastily organized camps, often in the open air. The inhabitants of villages caught in the epicenter of the fighting experienced a particular tragedy. The village of Vysokoye, located 300 meters from the western bank of the Isanets, was completely destroyed by artillery fire. Of the 160 residents, only 27 survived, having taken shelter in the church basement. They spent 8 days without water or food until they were discovered by Polish scouts. The fate of prisoners of war on both sides was unenviable. The Germans, experiencing a severe food shortage, kept Soviet and Polish prisoners in makeshift camps without basic amenities. Many did not survive due to hunger and disease. Polish officer Tadeusz Konopka, captured on the first day of the battle, later recalled, "The Soviet command, for its part, also could not provide decent conditions for German prisoners of war. They were used to clear minefields and collect the bodies of the dead, work associated with high risk. Mortality among prisoners was very high. A special page in the history of the battle was written by the exploits of military chaplains on both sides. German pastor Kurt Reinhardt, risking his life, ventured into no man's land to offer last comfort to the dying, regardless of their nationality." Polish chaplain Józef Kowalski was mortally wounded while trying to carry a wounded soldier from the battlefield. Medical services of both armies tried to observe an unspoken truce during the evacuation of the wounded. In rare moments of calm, white flags with a red cross were raised over the battlefield, and medics went out to collect the wounded. However, in the heat of battle, these rules were often violated. In the spring of 1945, people appeared on the banks of the Isanza, whose role in this bloody battle long remained in the shadows. French military observers, officers of the liaison mission to the Soviet command, witnessed one of the most dramatic episodes of the war's final stage. Colonel Jean-Pierre Duval, who led a group of 6 officers, kept detailed diaries, which later became an invaluable source of information about the battle. The French, with their rich experience of positional warfare from the First World War, were struck by the scale and intensity of the battle on the Isanza. Quote, wrote Major Henri Lefebvre, a specialist in fortifications, in his report. French officers noted the Germans' astonishing ability to create effective defenses in conditions of catastrophic resource shortages. The French paid particular attention to analyzing the causes of the high casualties among Soviet Polish troops. Captain René Michaud, a veteran of the battles for the Marne, pointed to several key factors. Firstly, an underestimation of the depth of the German defenses. Secondly, an excessive straightforwardness of attacks, without proper reconnaissance and preparation. Thirdly, the desire to force the river at any cost, even when the situation demanded a shift in the direction of the main thrust. French observers were struck by the heroism of the Polish soldiers who rushed to attack impregnable German fortifications. "This is insane bravery, bordering on despair," noted Lieutenant Pierre Dubois. "The Poles attack with such fury as if each of them is avenging a personal tragedy." Unlike many Soviet commanders, the French highly appreciated the German tactic of mobile defense. The Germans do not cling to every meter of land, they skillfully maneuver, concentrating forces in the most important directions. Colonel Duval wrote, Their defense is not a static line but a living organism capable of adapting to changing circumstances. The French observations on the influence of terrain on the nature of combat operations proved particularly valuable. Major Lefebvre compiled detailed maps of the relief of the Isanza banks, noting areas where the steepness of the banks and the speed of the current made forcing virtually impossible. These maps were subsequently used by the Soviet command in planning subsequent operations. French officers also noted the psychological aspect of the battle. The Germans fight with the despair of the doomed, Captain Michaud wrote. They understand that the war is lost, but strive to take as many enemies with them as possible. This gives their defense a special ferocity. In their reports to Paris, French observers warned of new trends in military art that emerged on the Isanza. We see the birth of new anti-tank defense tactics, Colonel Duval noted. The Germans use deeply echeloned minefields, anti-tank ditches, and mobile groups with Panzerfausts. This system could be used against our tank formations in the event of a new conflict. After the war, French analysts included the observations from the Isanza in the curricula of the Saint-Cyr Military Academy. The experience of this battle was studied as an example of effective defense in conditions of overwhelming enemy superiority in manpower and equipment. The memory of the tragic events on the Isanza lives on in stone, bronze, and the hearts of people from 3 countries. Today, the banks of this small river, once stained with the blood of thousands of soldiers, have become a place of mourning and reconciliation. The Tears of Isanza Memorial Complex, erected in 1973 on the river's eastern bank, has become the main symbol of remembrance for the fallen. The monumental composition of granite and bronze depicts Polish and Soviet soldiers supporting a wounded comrade. Sculptor Wacław Kowalski, whose father died in this battle, imbued his creation with not only skill, but also personal pain. Every year on April 25th, on the anniversary of the battle's bloodiest day, a commemoration ceremony is held here with the participation of veterans and official delegations from Russia and Poland. On the western bank, where German fortifications once stood, the German Reconciliation Memorial was opened in 1992. In contrast to the monumentality of the eastern complex, this site is characterized by restraint and minimalism. A simple granite obelisk bears an inscription in 3 languages. To all who fell on the Isanza, may their sacrifice be a lesson for the living. Around the obelisk is a field of 2,867 metal crosses, corresponding to the number of identified German soldiers who died in the battle. In the cultural memory of the 3 countries, the events on the Isanza are reflected differently. In Russia, this battle long remained in the shadow of larger engagements. Only in the 90s, with the declassification of archives, were historians able to assess the true scale of the tragedy. Today, in Russian textbooks, the Isanza is mentioned as an example of the heroism of Soviet soldiers and the complexity of the war's final stage. For Poland, the battle on the Isanza became a symbol of national sacrifice and brotherhood in arms with Soviet troops. Polish historiography emphasizes the heroism of Polish units, especially the 4th Infantry Division, which was almost entirely annihilated during the river crossing. Every year, Polish schools hold memorial lessons dedicated to these events. In modern Germany, the memory of the Isanza was long a taboo subject. Only since the 80s have German historians begun to objectively study this battle, noting not only the tactical skill of the German command, but also the senselessness of resistance in the face of inevitable defeat. Museums play a special role in preserving memory. The Museum of the Battle of Isanza, located in the former command post of Soviet troops, contains unique exhibits. Personal belongings of soldiers found by search parties, fragments of weapons, documents, and photographs. An interactive diorama allows visitors to see the dynamics of the battle and comprehend its scale. In recent years, a new tradition has emerged: joint treks by descendants of battle participants from both sides to the battlefields. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren of former adversaries together walk the path from the eastern bank of the Isanza to the western, symbolically completing the journey their grandfathers traversed under enemy fire. This initiative has become an important step towards genuine reconciliation and understanding the lessons of the past. The Battle of Isanza was not merely one of the last major clashes of World War II. It became a true laboratory of military thought, influencing the development of tactics and strategy for subsequent decades. Military theorists from all countries who studied the materials of this battle agree: Isanza changed the understanding of how modern defense should be constructed. The German concept of a deeply echeloned, flexible system of strong points was subsequently adopted by many armies around the world, including the Soviet one. American military experts, analyzing the battle documents in the 50s, concluded that it was the experience of Isanza that formed the basis of NATO's defensive doctrines during the Cold War. Of particular importance was the experience of anti-tank defense demonstrated by German units. The system of echeloned minefields, anti-tank ditches, and mobile groups with man-portable anti-tank weapons proved highly effective even against the massive use of armored vehicles. This experience was thoroughly studied and used in developing the concept of countering Soviet tank armadas in Europe. Soviet military theorists drew no less valuable lessons from the Battle of Isanza. The main one was the need for thorough reconnaissance and preparation before forcing water obstacles. Marshal Chuikov, who commanded the troops at Isanza, later wrote in his memoirs, "We paid too high a price for underestimating the enemy and overestimating our own capabilities." In the post-war years, the causes of the failures of the first days of the battle were studied in detail in Soviet military academies, which led to significant changes in the tactics of forcing water obstacles. The Polish military school also drew much from the experience of Isanza. The heroism of Polish units, their ability to act in the most difficult conditions, became the basis for the formation of national military traditions. At the same time, Polish military theorists paid special attention to analyzing command errors that led to unjustifiably high losses. The Battle of Isanza also influenced the development of military engineering art. German fortification solutions, such as multi-level bunkers with an underground communication system, became a model to emulate. Soviet engineers meticulously studied the designs of surviving German fortifications, many elements of which were subsequently used in creating defensive structures along the western borders of the USSR. Of particular value to military historians is the experience of interaction between different branches of service in complex conditions. The coordination of infantry, tank, artillery, and aviation actions at Isanza was far from always ideal, which led to tactical miscalculations and unjustified losses. The analysis of these errors contributed to the improvement of command and control systems in the post-war period. The lessons of Isanza were also reflected in the development of armaments. The experience of using anti-tank weapons in conditions of deeply echeloned defense led to the creation of new types of anti-tank missile systems. The difficulties encountered by sappers during demining contributed to the development of more advanced mine detectors and remote mine detection tools. Today, Decades after those bloody battles, Isanza remains not only a place of memory, but also an important lesson for military professionals. Annually, military academies from different countries send their cadets to the banks of this small river to study the peculiarities of the battle on the ground, understand the logic of the decisions made, and learn from the tragic mistakes of the past. In this, perhaps, lies the main legacy of Isanza, the transformation of tragedy into invaluable experience, helping to avoid similar sacrifices in the future.